I hope you've been noticing that we're following the Sermon on the Mount, which I would probably consider the most important moral document of our faith tradition, beginning with the Beatitudes, of course, which we would have had except for the Feast of the Presentation 2 weeks ago. Last week we had the next verses, and today we continue with chapter 5. So Jesus is saying, I'm going to fulfill, not abolish the law. And as he makes clear by what follows that we just heard, what he means is I'm going to deepen, make it more profound, make it more demanding, make it more interior. So it's not just about some external actions, but about what goes on inside you. And that's how our righteousness can surpass, those who are merely superficially observant, as he says. So then he speaks about, anger and killing. Thou shalt not kill. I said last week that that's kid stuff, except that a lot of people can't even manage that, especially, when you do it in big armies. But he says, what I say to you, Jesus says, whoever even gets angry with his brother is already liable to judgment. Why? Because that's the seed. That's the seed of the actions of killing and violence, etc. As soon as you let the demon, and it is a demon, let a demon of anger in, then you're already possessed, literally. And if you let the anger fester, that's why Paul says in Ephesians, don't let the sun go down on your anger. You shouldn't even let it in to begin with. But if it's there, don't let it grow and take root and multiply and bring other evil forces in the same wavelength into you, then you literally are possessed by your own anger, because then you'll be lost. It just multiplies. So he says, don't insult your brother. Raka. Rak means soft or weak in Hebrew. So it'd be like saying, you weakling, maybe even faggot, as an insult, or you fool, because that's just multiplying this inner disposition which is destructive. So you have to get into your heart, get into your inner world, and start fighting there. And the same thing then, he says, thou shalt not commit adultery. But whoever even looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery. Now, please, over the decades, I don't know how many people have come to me in confession tortured over, I was attracted to this woman and on the street. Well, first of all, notice that it's from the perspective of a man, which is the way things were in those days. And it's assumed the woman was married, so it's adultery, which is also the case in those days. But mutatis mutandis, adapted to our own circumstances. There's nothing wrong with being attracted. We're made that way. It's part of the joy of life. The whole universe is erotic in the broad sense of the word. From atoms, with the protons and the neutrons whirling around, and the planets whirling around the sun, to the divine eros of the intertrinitarian life, God's own inner life of love. We're made for love. We're made for attraction. It's part of the joy of life. The problem comes when our selfish egos get in the way and we start imagining things we're going to do to misuse or mistreat another person, whether it's with the anger or with the adultery or whatever it might be. That's where the problem comes in. When our passionate egos get in the way and everything is reduced to that dimension. So the fathers of the desert had this wonderful image, which I often mention, of we should be keeping watch. The ancient ascetical practice of custody of the heart, where you're keeping constant watch over every thought, every feeling that's coming in or going out, that you can, it's like a sentinel, they said, at the gates of a city. You're like the guard standing over your own city, your own city, with the city which you are. hopefully the city of God. And something comes up to the gates of the city, and you say, who's there? Who's going there? And it says, oh, I'm an angry thought. I'm a vengeful thought. I'm a manipulative thought. Then you say, well, you can't come in here. Go away. Don't even let them in. Because as soon as those things come in, they start raping and pillaging, and you're lost in your own inner world. So we really do have to interiorize our moral life. Have thought for your thoughts. What are you thinking moment by moment? What kind of nonsense, useless or even destructive nonsense is going on in our hearts and minds every second? Are we just letting it, have free rein, or are we actually keeping watch? What is constructive? What is building up the body of Christ? What is spreading peace and joy and hope in the world? How am I contributing positively? What kind of energy, what kind of vibes am I sending out? And therefore, what kind of vibes am I attracting? What kind of wavelength am I on in my own daily life? So that's where Jesus is asking us to go. Go into your heart. St. Teresa of Jesus has in her interior castle, the castle we're supposed to be guarding, the city we're supposed to be guarding, where Jesus is in the throne room in the center. But she says the outer areas are full of snakes. So we're going to find, stuff we have to clean out, in us. But that's part of the program, to purify and then replace the kind of thoughts and sentiments, feelings and desires that we have with what? And this is where it gets even more interesting. The second reading today from Corinthians, this also continues the first letter to the Corinthians that we started 2 weeks ago. Now remember, Paul began, again we didn't have this because of the Feast of the Presentation, but Paul begins in that first chapter by saying, you can't measure your life by the standards of the world. Look at Christ on the cross. The wisdom of the world is foolishness to God, whereas God's foolishness, God's mad foolishness revealed on the cross is wiser than human wisdom. It completely turns upside down all our expectations and all our habitual ways of thinking, more egotistical ways of thinking. And it says, the weakness of God manifest on the cross and by the Beatitudes of blessed are the meek and the merciful, it's the poor in spirit. That's the real wisdom. It's foolishness to the world, whereas God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. So it turns everything upside down. That's how far we have to go. And then he says, last week he said, so I didn't come among you with, persuasive or persuasive words of human wisdom. I came among you in weakness. I came among you preaching Christ crucified. That's when today's reading kicks in. And it says, but we do preach a wisdom. I just got finished saying that human wisdom is not at issue here. But we do preach a certain wisdom, a hidden wisdom, a mysterious wisdom. Are we even aware that wisdom is available and that we're called to receive it from God? Are we even aware that this is open to our consciousness, or that our consciousness is opened up to this? He says this is not a wisdom of the world, he goes on to affirm, or of the powers of this world. Otherwise, as he says, the powers would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So in other words, the powers that be, the egotistical powers of this world, religious powers or political powers, the very powers that crucified Jesus, they didn't understand this wisdom, or they wouldn't have crucified him. It's all just expediency and what's good for them and for us, on a superficial level. But the hidden wisdom, that's the wisdom of God. Now, Paul here in this passage, and I'm going to be commenting on the whole rest of the chapter because we never get it in the Sunday lectionary. He says that the Spirit searches the deep things of God. Now, Paul here and throughout the rest of the chapter appropriates Gnostic language, the language of the Gnostics. And of course, you all know Gnosticism is bad, right? St. Irenaeus in the 2nd century wrote a whole treatise against the Gnostics. But Paul, in several places, and especially here, uses Gnostic language to show that we can use it to explain our own mysteries. So bathi, the deep things of God, was a Gnostic phrase. So he says, the Spirit searches all things, including the deep things of God. And we have received this Spirit. Wow! We've received the Spirit that searches all things, even the deep things of God. So how is your consciousness doing with that? Are you aware of searching all things, even the deep things of God? We've received the Spirit, Paul says. We have to go down into that level of depth. So it's not just about standing over a guard over our heart so that by the power of grace, by our willpower, we can suppress evil thoughts, and if we do that successfully, our whole life will finally go to heaven. Please. No. It's about the entire transformation of our consciousness to be able to see as God sees, to have God's own very Spirit, to search all things, even the deep things of God. Paul goes on to say, who understands a human being's spirit except the human's spirit within us? Well, similarly, who understands God's except God's own Spirit? But we have received that Spirit to understand spiritual things and to understand, he says, the gifts that we've received from God. Then he uses more Gnostic phraseology. He says the unspiritual person, psychikos, is one who doesn't understand this. We cannot understand this. Living simply on the level of the passions that we've just heard about in the gospel. But the spiritual person understands all this. And those are Gnostic phrases. And the spiritual person knows, well, the very deep things of God. He goes on to say that who understands God? Who has been his counselor? And then he says, he concludes the chapter by saying, we have the mind of Christ. That's astounding. Are we aware of having the mind of Christ? So we don't just see with our own human eyes, we see with Christ's eyes. We feel with Christ's heart. We have God's own Spirit to search the deep things of God, to search the deep things of our own hearts and minds, to search all things, the whole universe, to understand as Christ does. Paul says it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And Paul says later to the Corinthians, we're being transformed from one degree of glory to another, even by the Lord who is the Spirit. And when he says at the beginning of his ministry, Jesus, repent, the word actually means have your whole consciousness renewed. Change your whole outlook. He says also, it says in the letter to the Colossians, you put off the old person, put on the new person, renewed in knowledge after the image of the one who created it. Be renewed in the spirit of your mind, it says to the Romans. He says to the Romans. So our whole consciousness is transformed into that of Christ. That's the goal of our Christian life. Not just leading moral lives, but being Christ in the world. Having the mind of Christ, the heart of Christ. Being utterly transformed in him and living as Christ in the world. That's what we're called to. So it's not just keeping our own house in order, but surrendering our house to the great King who lives at the center and allowing him to be the one who guides and inspires all our thoughts and actions and feelings. so that they're His actions and thoughts and feelings. And that's incredibly ecstatic and marvelous and transformative and liberating to experience that. To let that become our habitual identity and our habitual way of living in the world. So let's take this journey seriously to allow ourselves to be made, transformed into Christ and have His mind and heart. That's our true calling and our true joy.